So before we go any further, I would like to have our acknowledgement that we like to say at the beginning of our meetings. The Owen Sound Field Naturalists gratefully acknowledge the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, the people of the three fires known as Ojibway, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. We give thanks to the Saugeen First Nation number 29 and the Chippewas of Nawash, unceded First Nation, collectively known as the Saugeen Ojibway Nation, the traditional keepers of this land. As field naturalists, we accept our responsibility to be good stewards of this land in this time and into the future. So, John, would you like to introduce our esteemed guest? Oh, we can't hear you. You have to turn your mic on.
How's that?
Perfect.
Great. So yeah, welcome to everybody to kick off our season. I see a few more numbers coming in, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers. The prime candidate that I've dealt with in setting this up is Ryan Lauzon. And some of you may remember that when the Reptile and Amphibian Atlas was first introduced, Ryan came and talked to the club at one of the members' nights. He wasn't a member of the club, but he called me and asked if he could do that. And I said, certainly. And he gave a nice intro for that. And so I always remember that name. In fact, I even invited him onto the board, and he agreed until he found out that the meetings time of the board meetings didn't work for him with his traveling and his family. So anyway, we'll see about that in the future. And just as a side note on the Reptile and Amphibian Atlas, Alan McNaughton, who came and led the moth night for us here at the Conservation Authority and also did one for us last year in McGregor. Alan is the fellow who wrote the code for that Reptile and Amphibian Atlas. So everybody's helping out in different ways. The other thing I wanted to mention was that there are a few people in the club who are always coming up with great suggestions for speakers and topics and field trips and that sort of thing. And one of the best is David Morris. And David sent me a message. What about this idea? We've got this new name for the bridge and it's about sturgeon. Maybe we could have a talk about that. And so we reached out to Ryan because that's part of what he does. So I'm just going to turn it over to Ryan Lauzon and his two colleagues that are going to present tonight. And I'm really looking forward to this. But thank you, everybody, David Morris, for suggesting this. And it's great to have Ryan back in front of the membership. Way you go.
Take it away there, Sid.
Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Sidney, and I'm an elder and counselor for the Chippewas and Nawash, and have worked closely with Ryan and Fisheries over the past several years. And in this past year with Duncan as a research coordinator for the Fisheries Department that we have going here on the Chippewas and Nawash. So tonight we're here to speak about the Gitche-Name-wikwedong, and that's the Great Sturgeon Bay. And it's so named from my ancestors and Alex's ancestors that lived in the territory here for I don't know how long, thousands and thousands of years. So the Sturgeon Bay is on the old maps. I don't know how long it had been put there, but I have seen it on old maps from late 1700s, early 1800s. So my ancestors, that's what they called the body of water that leads into Owen Sound. And we, the Chippewas and Nawash, once resided on the west bank, just north of Owen Sound. So that the whole area up to about Cobble Beach was part of the reserve there. So if you can move to the next slide, Alan. So the overview is we're talking about sturgeon, we're talking about the fisheries assessment, and we're talking about research that is going on through the First Nations regarding Georgian Bay and Lake Huron. Okay, next slide. So this is the territory that was the Saugeen Ojibway Nation Territory, quite a large territory. Back in 1836, there was a surrender up to Owen Sound of 1.5 million square miles. And part of that surrender was the promise that the rest of the peninsula would be held in our interest from that time forward. So next slide. So here we have out in Lake Huron, the Alpena Amberley Ridge. And this dates back to, well, almost 10,000 years ago. And there was this large ridge that ran basically up through the center of Lake Huron. And that was it was a major caribou passageway at that time. And my ancestors would have utilized that narrow strip of land, which is about 15 miles wide, which is about 1.5 times the width of the peninsula. So that was a major runway for the caribou, and the native people took advantage of that run and actually hunted the caribou there. Okay, next slide.
Before we go to the next slide, Ryan, this where it comes off would be Point Clark, right? Or Sid? Like over here?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
just for those watching.
So the reason that they know about this as a caribou hunting area is that those same practices are still held in the Arctic regions for hunting caribou. And you see the lines of stone, the fellow walking along, there's lines of stone. And those were placed specifically to herd the reindeer in between these lines of stone and move them along to certain spots that would be kill spots for the hunting. Next slide. So these are pieces of when they made their weaponry for spears and arrows for the hunting. They used a cinnamon, I think is the stone is called. And this is what led them to actually do more and more research on this Amberley Ridge, because they were finding this pieces of stone, chips of stone. And they knew that they were used for making arrowheads, spearheads, different weaponry of the native people at the time. And they were finding a lot of these small shards of this Assiniboine stone on that ridge. Next slide. So we're getting to what is the sturgeon, and it's probably the longest living fish that I've ever heard of. I don't know if there's longer living fish other places in the world, but it could live anywhere for 100 years to 150 years old, and they traveled the whole lake. They're a late maturing fish, and I had read that they only spawn anywhere between 2 and 7 years apart after they mature and actually start to lay eggs. There's 29 species worldwide, so we're not just unique to the Great Lakes here. They're recognized by the the caudal fin on the tail, and there's no scales, and there's 5 lateral rows of bony plates called skullets. This is more Ryan's Ryan and Alex. So if we can move to the next, and if there's anything that you want to add in as we're going along through these, please do. So one of the largest is what's known as Beluga Sturgeon, and there's a female captured in the Volga estuary, measuring 7.2 meters long or 24 feet long, and weighing about 1,571 kilograms, which is 346 something pounds. The fish are adromatous. They not only survive in freshwater, but they can survive in salt waters. They're bottom feeders, and the sturgeon can live to be more than the 100 years old. There's ages going up to 150 years old that have been caught over time. Next.
Oh, and I think we have the car in there as, was that for the weight, Ryan?
Yeah.
Yeah, just to give an idea, when we're talking about a big sturgeon, it weighs as much as a SUV, which is pretty incredible.
Correct, yeah, and the sturgeon that we have in the Great Lakes is called the lake sturgeon, and they're a very ancient fish. They've remained relatively unchanged for a very long time. But anyways.
So this is a fossil that was found in anywhere between during the Jurassic period of 174 million to 163.5 million years old, and so they knew that they haven't changed a lot in all of these millions of years. They're basically the same fish that cruise now. They're prehistoric monsters that have survived over time.
I just wanted to add one thing, and that's looking at that fossil there, you can kind of see a little bit, but the caudal fin, or the tail fin, what is unique about the sturgeon is it's shaped like the same as a shark fin at the back, which is kind of neat. You don't see that in too many fish, so just an interesting feature of sturgeon in general.
So the lake sturgeon is now becoming an endangered species in Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. They range the whole lake, and I would imagine over time they actually would have swam the whole lake many times over in their lifetime. They're almost like large submarines that just continue to travel the lake bottom. And so this one here, they're talking about the 310-pound sturgeon, which is rather small to what they had been over time. And there's many factors, I think, that contribute to the fact that the sturgeon are tending to be smaller. There's still the odd one that's caught that's quite large, but many of the smaller fish are in around 4 or 5 feet and only weighing 50, 60 pounds.
I'd just like to point out that there's a photo in the bottom right corner there that was taken from our archives at the fishery office. And I don't know, Sid, it looks like a Nadjiwon to me. I don't know who exactly that is.
No,
But
actually, that fellow is Peter Jones
okay.
from the Jones family up here. And that was, I don't know what year that would be, but I recognize, I can't see it because of the little strip of people covering that thing, but I know which photo it is. We were looking at it the other day when we were putting this presentation together, and that's one of our local fishermen, Rovichard, that has a sturgeon there in one of the fishing tugs. So this is the maybe you want to talk to this, Alex, the life cycle.
Yeah, for sure. So for the lake sturgeon, they spawn in rivers where they lay eggs, and the eggs are fertilized, and those eggs tend to stick to rocks. They'll hatch the following spring, and then the larvae will drift downstream. The juveniles will remain around the rivers, feeding and growing in size, and then as they get bigger, they'll move into deeper water in the Great Lakes. And being bottom feeders, they're usually hanging around on the bottom. You can see there they have barbells sticking out from their mouth to help them feel around their sensory organs. There's also a number of pores on their snout that also help them get an idea of what's around them. It could be pretty dark at the bottom of the lake sometimes. And then, as Sid said, they're all throughout Lake Huron and Georgian Bay, but the historic range of sturgeon is quite extensive. However, that range today is much reduced as they are endangered and threatened in much of Canada and the US.
Okay, so the name for the sturgeon is Neme, and that's in reference to a prayer in the Ojibway language. And they were always regarded as a highly spiritual fish, and they were much counted on by the Ojibway people as a food source. I was looking at articles where they used the bones for needles, other bones for either spearheads or arrow points, and they used every part. The stomachs were used for drum covers. The leathery skin was used as leather. So they've been used very extensive over time, and much is the same as the deer, the caribou, bear. They really valued. They were a valued fish. So in our culture, we have what is called the clan system. There's many different clans that make up families, and the Sturgeon clan was just one of those clans. We have Wolf clan, Bear clan, Deer clan. I myself is from the Crane clan. So the Sturgeon clan were considered scholars, professors, lawyers, mediators, poets. They were ones to actually record things over time. not in the same way that we know it today, but they did have birch bark scrolls that were recorded and kept over time. So the lake sturgeon then have to migrate back to their birthplace to spawn, and we as the indigenous people, I've heard stories where the sturgeon were so many at the time that at the river mouths at the time of spawning, you would be able to walk across the river mouth on the backs of the fish. So there was that many at one time. Okay, next slide.
So I don't know if it was Ryan or you, Sid, who put this in there, but I don't know if one of us wants to read it. I'll leave that to you and Ryan.
For me, the writing is very small, but it's just kind of there to show that the sturgeon were part of our culture and part of our stories that have lived throughout the thousands of years. And this is just one of them. And it's talking about Nanabajo, who was part man, part Manitou. And he's a reminder of the best and the worst in people. So over time, there's many Nanabajo stories that leave behind lessons for us as people. So I don't know this particular story. Ryan was able to find it. I had seen the name of it, Nanabajo and Soaring Eagle and the Great Sturgeon. So he just actually found the story and added it in here, but it's more for the purpose of just understanding that legends are made up of some fact, some fiction, and they take us through time to learn as people. It is said that we as Native people have learned from the animals, from the birds, from the fish. And when totem poles are made, man is always at the bottom of the totem pole. And that is because we have always known that should we lose one of these fish, birds, animals, should we lose one of them, the rest would survive. But we as people, losing any one complete, whether it's fish or whether it's birds or whether it's animals, we too will be gone. So this is a teaching that has followed us over time and is much respected. And that's why you see totem poles and man is always at the bottom.
I would just add that this presentation is recorded, and upon approval from Nawash and Saugeen, we may be able to share it with everyone. So you could read this legend on your own. And I think one of the cool things about lake sturgeon in particular is that, like Sid and I've said, they've remained unchanged. So thousands of years ago, the sturgeon that our ancestors would be catching are very similar to the ones today, almost identical.
So history of the sturgeon in the Great Lakes, they from the time period they've changed as the lakes change over, tens of thousands of years. The water wasn't always where it is today, and as the water changed places, so did the fish. So they're probably one of the greatest survivors, I guess you would say, that have lived through many different global changes over time and still managed to keep their place in the waters. So they were much traded at the time when the European settlers first come in the 1800s. And we did know at the time that salting fish, that you were able to keep it for long periods of time. And we actually used salt for salting fish for hundreds and hundreds of years, with Lake Huron having one of the largest salt, I don't know what you'd call it, deposits, I guess. So it was known by the native people to go and collect the salt, and that the fish could be dried and salted. So it was one of the first trading tools, I guess you'd say, or foods that was traded with the Europeans as they came to the region. So because of their sheer size, sturgeon have damaged commercial nets quite extensively over time. The European fishermen, as they began timbering and fishing as a economic subsidy of the people coming in, the sturgeon started to become what would be considered a pest, I guess you would say. So in that, as they were viewed more of a pest than they were for food or whatnot, they were starting to be decimated for absolutely no good reason other than to get them out of the water so other fish could be caught. Next slide. Oh, did want to say about there's a photo, and Alex had added a photo in here a little farther on, where the steamships, when the steamships were first starting to run the Great Lakes, these fishermen would pile the sturgeon on the shores along the almost like cordwood, I guess you would say. And the skin was very oily and leathery, and I guess would burn for long periods of time. So these steamships would use it as a fuel source to move the these steamers up and down the lakes. Next slide. So I was mentioning the picture, and I've tried to find that picture, and I haven't been able to. I can't remember where I had seen it, but there's huge stacks of these sturgeon just laid up on the shore to dry, and they were just burnt in the steamers. So in the late 1800s, they realized that caviar could be taken from the fish, and much of the world's caviar at that time was from the Great Lakes region. There was a lot of fish caught at that time just for the purpose of caviar. It became an economic builder for the society, and they just we lost so many over time just for that reason. So they were catching them for no other reason than to take the eggs and burn them in the steamers. And then in the early 20th century, all of the paper mills that were, well, there was not only the paper mills, but the dams that were put in the rivers to run the sawmills were a big roadblock or whatever for the fish to make their way up the rivers efficiently, and the pollutants in the water, and that just continually dropped the numbers of the fish that were spawning and reproducing.
And that's a similar story for a number of native fish species, like suckers. There's several species of suckers that spawn in rivers, and also a few native species of lamprey that are in the Great Lakes. I just like to point out the photo on the right-hand side there. That's a photo that was taken in Georgian Bay somewhere. I couldn't find the exact location, but as you can see, those are two quite large sturgeon. The bigger one, 121 pounds. Just goes to show how big these fish are and how important they were, especially in our area.
And I wanted to add a little bit something as well, and that's that these sturgeon that we're talking about, and we're thinking about Great Sturgeon Bay. So the amount of sturgeon that must have been in Owens Sound for it to have got that name must have been quite incredible at one time. But you think about all the local rivers, and most of them do have dams. For example, the Saugeen River was at one time an extremely important river for sturgeon to spawn in. And as we know, there's Denny's Dam, not too far off the mouth, and many other dams. And, it just blocks the fish from being able to move out, so up the river and spawn. So there's just basically most of the rivers, there's just nowhere left for them to spawn. And I would say that probably within the Saugeen territory, probably the biggest producer of sturgeon these days is the Nadjiwon River. And typically when I talk to fishermen and they are finding sturgeon, quite often they're small sturgeon that are coming out of that river. It's one of the rivers that's still producing some numbers of sturgeon anyway. Thanks.
So we have a picture here of the Alma Research Station, and I visited there just about 2 years ago, I believe. And at that time, they had tubs and tubs of these little sturgeon, and I thought they were going to actually put these fish as a stocking program back into the lake, and found out that they were strictly, these sturgeon were strictly raised as a research tool to try and understand better how the small sturgeon react to the lampricides that have been used now for I don't know how many years. But they're just starting to realize that putting the lampricide in there may be another obstruction to the sturgeon reproducing, or there being actual young ones that survive once they have to live through this lampricide polluted water. So down in the bottom right-hand corner is a picture of passenger pigeons. And this would probably be somewhere in, I'm going to guess, the mid to late 1800s. And at that time, the Bruce Peninsula housed and nest somewhere in the area of 3 billion passenger pigeons. And this here is a picture of passenger pigeons. And I would dare say it's probably 30 feet high, and I don't know how far across that would be. But we're looking at probably hundreds of thousands of birds right there in the picture. And they were killed for really no reason other than farmers were worried about crops, and they used to hunt them in the evening as a sporting event to pass the time in the evenings. So we as Native people, having seen the passenger pigeons disappear, when you see pictures like this here, now comes the, now we're worried that the sturgeon is going to be decimated, to that there will be no more. So once they're extinct, and there's nothing that anyone can do. So when I was at the Alma Research Station, I was thinking that that would have been a great project to put these sturgeon in the back into the lake. But after thinking about it for a while, I realized that wouldn't have been a good idea, because those sturgeon would then, having been hatched in the hatchery, would be looking for that hatchery water to return to and spawn. So to raise fish in a facility like this is not the answer to restock the lake.
Just one comment, there was a minor mistake. So that image is actually not passenger pigeons. I apologize. I put that in. It is in fact buffalo skulls. But I think the sentiment remains.
Yeah.
My apologies. One maybe comment on Lamprey. There are a number of tributaries and rivers and streams in the Great Lakes that are treated with lamprey. There's the two main ones right there, TFM, which is 3-trifluoromethyl-4-nitrophenol. They use that along with niclosamide or Belucide. And in addition to lamprey, there's also a number of dams that prevent upstream migration of lamprey. They too, sea lamprey, they too spawn in rivers, and those two methods of control, one, the dam that blocks migration for sturgeon, and then lampreycides, although they're targeted at sea lamprey, there are impacts to non-target species. My apologies about the buffalo skull thing. It was a weird article. Anyways, Ryan, you can take it away.
Sorry, I was on mute there. Let's give me a second to catch up to where we're at here. So just starting off with this slide, it's really just the idea about the you know, we're kind of switching gears from talking about lake sturgeon at this point. That we just, as mentioned earlier by Sid, we wanted to go into a little bit about the Saugeen fishery, as well as the assessment program and some of the research work that we're doing. So just kind of starting out with just a little bit of a discussion about the Saugeen fishery, and I think Sid kind of already highlighted the fact that you know, the fishery and Saugeen's connection to that fishery has been something that's gone on since time immemorial, as they say, thousands of years, and that interdependence. So these are just a few of the shots just showing you know, some a little tiny sliver of that history going back into time. And you know, whether it be lake trout, whether it be lake sturgeon, lake whitefish, you know, there's many different species of fish in the Great Lakes that all are an important piece of that particular puzzle. Next slide.
Oh, I just maybe mention that the access of the Lauzon and our peoples to the fishery has been hasn't been so easy as it is today. There's been a history of exclusion and imposed regulations and rules on our fishery and how we interact with it. And Ryan, do you want to? I just muted myself. The Jones-Nadjiwon decision.
Yeah, absolutely. So as previously mentioned, so if you look back into the history at the time of contact, as Sid had mentioned, the fishery was obviously controlled by the Saugeen Ojibway Nation and the ancestors of the Saugeen Ojibway Nation. And then as time moved on and the settlers came in, there were periods of time when the Saugeen Ojibway Nation actually leased out parts of the fishery to some of the settlers. So settlers that were coming in would basically have a lease from the First Nations that would allow them to catch some fish. And then along came legislation such as the Fisheries Act that ended up meaning that the government essentially the Crown decided that they would rather see the fishery given out to some of their cronies and so on, which is really what happened. And the fishing for the sod, according to the government, after the Fisheries Act, was basically just a little tiny postage stamp around each reserve. So after that period of time, the fishermen continued to fish, but according to the government, it would have been illegally. So they were fighting a lot of fines and things like that, and eventually it ended up in court. For those that have been around Owen Sound an area for some time, they would probably remember the Justice Fairgrieve decision, also known as the Jones-Nadjiwon decision, where there was a commercial fisherman, Francis Nadjiwon, and he was essentially charged by the Ministry of Natural Resources and taken to court for overfishing. The chief at that time, Howard Jones, was also wrapped up in that court case, and the eventual result was that the court determined that and reaffirmed that right to a commercial fishery that Saugeen had, and as of today, within the commercial fishing waters of the Saugeen are the only ones remaining that are commercial fishing, and the province ended up buying out the quota from the non-native commercial fishermen.
I would just like to add, there is an excellent TV documentary series about the peninsula and the history of fishing, not so much the court decision and the court case, sort of more so interactions with settlers and Indigenous peoples a long time ago. It's called The Fishing Chiefs. It's a TVO documentary. It's free. I don't know if that linked worked. Maybe I didn't put www. But if you just Google TVO Fishing Chiefs, it's a 3-part series. It's very good. You can learn a lot about the peninsula and our fishery.
So just to add to that, I'm a brother of Francis Nadjiwon, who was charged in that court case. And as I've said, I've got about 55 years that I've been involved in fishing. My father was a fisherman. My grandfather was a fisherman. And most of the people that had any existence on both of these reserves were fishermen. So it's just carried on from one generation to the next. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Sid. So just moving on in the next slide, just a little bit about the sod fishery today. So when we're talking about the sod fishery today, it's really dominated by lake whitefish. However, some other species are important as well, in particular yellow perch, lake trout, and pickerel or walleye, whatever you want to, whatever name you want to call them. And then some of the ciscos, lake herring, and at one time, chub were quite important. And really, the fleet has two different styles of boats. So you can see the punt style vessel there on the bottom left, and then the Lake Erie style commercial fishing tug. That's yeah, the larger vessel there that's enclosed. Most of the time they're fishing with gill nets, which are usually bottom set. Lake whitefish tend to be fairly benthic and feeders, so they're typically towards the bottom. However, there are some other methods of fishing with gill nets, canning or kite netting that you can use to kind of lift the net up a little bit off the bottom at certain times of the year when that might be more effective. And the Saugeen operate the largest Canadian Indigenous fishery on the Great Lakes.
I would just like to add that this is mostly speaking to the commercial fishery. A lot of our peoples engage in recreational fishing or subsistence fishing through other means like rod and reel or spearing. Just wanted to add that.
Yep, for sure. So just talking a little bit about the fisheries assessment program. So the fisheries assessment program was set up by the nations shortly after the Jones-Nadjiwon decision. And really the purpose of the fisheries assessment program was to keep track and monitor the commercial harvest. And essentially, that's my position is overseeing and running our fisheries assessment program, and it's my responsibility with the program to provide all the information about the fishery to the joint councils so that they can make decisions about the fishery and how the fishery is managed. But in addition to that, we also are very active and engaged in a number of different research projects. And we're also involved in supporting the community and the fish harvesters. And in particular, over the last few years with the COVID, which I'm sure everybody's sick and tired of hearing about by now. I know I am. But anyway, it did hit the fish harvesters really hard because most of the fish that is caught ends up in the restaurant industry out of the Great Lakes, and the restaurant industry was hit very hard by COVID and a lack of demand for fish. So really the market's dried up, and fish harvesters have had a really tough go of it the last couple of years. And not only that, but just for community members in general, you know, it's been quite a struggle with COVID. So chief and council decided to set up a program to purchase fish off the fish harvesters and supply local food banks, both at Nawash and Saugeen, but also in Wyerton. Some went to Owen Sound, as well as some of the friendship centers across Ontario. And the other thing that that's something we're really trying to focus on is with respect to to education about the fishery. So this would be part of that initiative. And then creating signs and just creating more general awareness about the fishery, because I feel that there is certainly a lot of misinformation out there in the media and so on, and a lot of people don't really understand the sod fishery. So this next slide is just a few of the key concepts, because we're going to be starting to talk about some of our research. There's a few concepts that may be unfamiliar to you that will help you understand the research that we do. So one of those concepts is this idea of Indigenous ecological knowledge, and in particular the Saugeen Ojibway Nation ecological knowledge. So, you know, we can get into some fancy language about the knowledge, practice, belief complex, and way of knowing, but what we're really talking about is this idea that San ancestors going back for thousands of years have been fishing these waters and had a really close relationship with those waters, and really have built over all that time a really strong knowledge about the environment, about the fish, and about all the relationships between those. And not to say that this is something that's stuck back in the past, but this idea that San community members are continuing this way of life, and that, you know, it changes with time as well, and this knowledge adapts and changes over time as new things come along, changes in the climate and so on. So anyway, the approach that we take to research is something that called two-eyed seeing, which was a concept that a Mi'kmaq elder, Dr. Albert Marshall, came up with. And this idea that in order to understand complex problems, you really need more than one perspective in order to be able to fully understand something, or understand something much better than you would be if you were just to use one knowledge system. So most of you are familiar with Western science and the scientific method and so on, and that particular approach to understanding the world. And so the idea behind two-eyed seeing is that you know, you could go around and just look at things through one particular eye, such as Western science or the Saugeen Ojibway Nation ecological knowledge, and you would kind of have a bit of an idea of what's going on, but you wouldn't have the full perspective that you would by using both approaches. So that's really our approach to research, is using Western science as well as Saugeen Ojibway Nation ecological knowledge. And then finally, that our research is very much community based, which means that community members are the ones that come up with the research questions, and then they guide the research the whole way through. So that's important to us, to make sure that the research is relevant to the community, and that the community are closely linked to the research.
So using these concepts, we engaged in a research project a couple of years ago. I did this research as my master's degree, my master's thesis research. And in the Saugeen, there were a number of concerns from community members about a group of fish known as ciscos. And in the Great Lakes, there's two groups, I guess. There's the lake herring, which is a shallow water cisco, and it's only one species, and then the chub. And chub are a deep water species. They were very prominent in the Great Lakes, especially in commercial fisheries throughout the late and mid 1900s. They were prized because being such a deep water fish, they were very oily, and when smoked, they were seen as a delicacy. And an intensive commercial fishery wiped out all the different types of chub in the Great Lake, leaving behind one very small chub, which is too small to catch and sell for any good commercial value. So we have the chub, which were important commercial fish, especially when we started our commercial fishery in the 90s, and then lake herring, which have been an important fish for thousands of years. They're very similar to a lake whitefish. They're a little different. There's a fish box of lake herring on the right there. And the Saugeen was concerned about the status of ciscos. There was some severe declines in the late 90s and early 2000s of chub that led to the complete stop of that fishery in Saugeen waters. There were not enough chub left, and they were too small to sell. So people in the communities were asking about them, and this prompted this research study, which used two-eyed seeing. It was community-based, I got to do it for my master's. It was very great. We interviewed 19 fish harvesters who had experiences in the past fishing for both lake herring and chub. I would sit down with these individuals and we'd have a long form discussion about these fish and touch on all sorts of different things, from culture to how these fish impacted the community. And in addition to our discussion, I brought a map to every meeting, every interview, and we mapped out their distribution and some past harvest locations, spawning locations, and movement throughout the lake. I'll show the map after this slide, but we use that spatial and temporal information to actually go out and sample for these fish. The lake herring are fairly common around the peninsula at this time, so we're able just to source those from some of our fish harvesters. Lake herring spawn very close to lake whitefish, and in recent years they've been growing in population, so it's fairly easy to get them. And then we also sampled for chub, which our fish harvesters haven't really fished for about 15 to 20 years. And we were able to successfully find chub on all three of our excursions. And it was really cool being on the boat. It was the first time these fish harvesters had seen chub in a long time. And it was promising, not in the commercial sense, but in the sense that they're still out there and thriving. We caught on average 300 chub on each of the three outings. So this is the map that was created. The blue represent past chub harvest locations or spawning locations. The lines indicate movement. The map's quite large. It's hard to see the arrows, but the arrows indicate what direction the fish would move in. The green is lake herring harvest and lake herring movement. And then the gray is cisco, which is actually round whitefish, but locally they're referred to as cisco for some reason. But anyways, as you can see from this map, there's a wealth of knowledge there, a wealth of spatial and temporal knowledge. And the cool thing is that each of these features, each of these polygons and lines, there's a specific story tied to each of them. So this was, it was awesome. I learned quite a considerable amount, and I think it just goes to show the importance and the utility of this knowledge. Fish are hard to track at times. They're hard to find. You never know really where they are unless you have like a transmitter in them and you're tracking them. So yeah, that was our Cisco project, and that kind of paved the way for a research initiative right now that the Saugeen is engaged in, called Together with Gigoyak. Gigoyak is the Ojibway word for fishes, and the title
Hey there, Alex,
represents.
before you move on, you missed out one of the cool things about that project.
Oh yes, we
Yeah.
at lending to the two-eyed seeing approach. When we sampled these fish, we were linked up with the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, and they showed us how to measure these fish. There's a lot of complexities in the taxonomy of these fish. A lot of debate out there. So how they identify specific forms or species is through a number of body length ratio measurements. So we were invited down to the States to learn how to do that, and we did that. And once the information was processed, it turns out that the lake herring that was caught around the fishing islands just south of Stokes Bay, there was a novel form of lake herring that was previously unknown to Western science, but of course the Saugeen fishermen have known this lake herring for a long time. So that was pretty cool. It's called the short-head cisco of the Western Bruce Peninsula or the Western Saugeen Peninsula. Not a very flashy name, but it's cool. It's cool to contribute to science like that, I feel. That was what you meant, right, Ryan?
That's absolutely what I meant.
Right. Okay. So back to Together with Gigo. So the title basically just represents our commitment to work with our partners, and our partners being Parks Canada and the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, who recently changed their name. I think now it's the Ontario Ministry of Northern Development, Mines and Forestry. Much longer acronym. In the middle there, we have an image that was created by one of our community members, Charmaine Jenner. There's a lot of meaning in this photo. I'll briefly touch on it. It's hard to really capture it all. To hear her speak about it's something else, but on the top there, you can see there's 7 feathers sticking out. That's representing the 7 grandfather teachings. That's very important to Ojibway people. I can't say I know them off the top of my head, but some of them are like love, humility, respect. So that represents the 7 grandfather teachings. There's 3 heads, the middle one being the Saugeen, and then the left and right being Parks Canada and the ministry. And as you can see, we're all sharing eyes, lending to the 2-eyed seeing approach. The eagles, one's looking in the past, the other one's looking forward. There's 2 fish. There's a lot of meaning. I think it's really cool. It's one of the coolest paintings I've ever seen, I think. Maybe I'm biased, but anyways, yeah, so there's a number of different research projects embedded with this initiative, and this initiative came from community concerns over lake whitefish. And as sturgeon were a very important fish to the Saugeen, so were lake whitefish. Lake whitefish are the main commercial fish, and they have been for quite some time. And then, in past times, they've been very important to the Saugeen. There's stories like the sturgeon where the whitefish were so plentiful before contact that you could walk over their backs when they're spawning. And right now, the lake whitefish in Lake Huron and Georgian Bay are experiencing severe declines. And we started this initiative to learn more about the whitefish and the declines. And there's some of the projects there listed. Like the Cisco project, we're going to be holding interviews with knowledge holders and fish harvesters about whitefish. We're engaging in acoustic telemetry, which Ryan will explain in a second, shoal and habitat assessment, larval fish assessment, and indicator monitoring and index netting. And this initiative is, I think, pretty groundbreaking in the Great Lakes. A collaboration from federal, provincial, and the First Nation level is pretty cool, and we're gaining a lot of traction and doing a lot of cool work. So I'll pass it over Ryan to explain acoustic telemetry.
Yeah, so as Alex mentioned, one of the things that we're doing under Together with Gigo mantle is this idea of acoustic telemetry. And essentially what we're doing is surgically implanting transmitters. You can see one being implanted in the picture of the fish there on the bottom left. And essentially that transmitter that we're putting inside of a fish is sending out a signal out into the water. And then what we do is we go out and put some receivers out throughout the lake, and those receivers basically pick up that signal that's being sent out from the fish. And probably about once a year, you go and retrieve the receiver, and you can see a receiver there on the picture on the bottom right there. And anyway, you go along, you pick up your receiver, and you hook it up to your computer, and you can take the information that was collected from the receiver and retrieve that information and learn what fish passed by and when. So each transmitter has its own signal, so you could tell which fish that you had that had swam by, and then also what time it had swum by at. And so by doing this, we actually can get a pretty good idea of how whitefish and probably lake trout in the future as well, or what they're doing out there in the lake and where they are at particular times. So right here is a picture just showing some of our possible areas that we're going to be tagging the fish, and those are the circles, but we're still figuring those out. Where we started the project last fall was actually right at Gitche-Name-wikwedong, which is the blue circle that Alex is pointing to with the cursor. And we did tag about 50 fish there. And each little dot represents a receiver. Each receiver is about 23 kilometers apart from the next receiver. And we have, right now, we have all the receivers in Georgian Bay done, as well as the North Channel. So you can see that there. And then probably next year, we'll be moving on with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Parks Canada to complete Lake Huron. And then we've also been in active discussions with our counterparts in the US, and it looks quite likely that we'll be able to get the US side. So it's actually a binational, turning into a binational project. And one of the interesting things is that we're actively engaged with some knowledge holders in the territory to know, basically to show us the best places and the time and everything else to go out and catch those fish. And we actually hire the fishermen to go out and catch those fish for us, to put the receivers in. So it's really a partnership with the fishermen as well. I think that's pretty important.
Yeah, that's actually
moving
how we
on.
selected the first location at Nawash there. We spoke with some fish harvesters, and lo and behold, when we went out, we were able to catch some spawning whitefish. So it worked out perfectly.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll maybe just briefly talk about some other tagging efforts, acoustic telemetry. So we're talking about sturgeon. This is around Sault Ste. Marie. There's Garden River First Nation in the green and Batchewana First Nation, and they've done quite a bit of work tagging sturgeon. A sturgeon up there for them is also very important. And there's just some information here. They've tagged about 60 fish, and they've been learning lots. We've had the opportunity to speak with them and see a couple of their presentations, and it's very cool to see the same sort of techniques, blending this indigenous knowledge with more technical Western science approaches to research like acoustic telemetry. So just wanted to throw that in there. We're not the only ones in Lake Huron doing it, but yeah. And then just in that circle, that's up where they're doing it in like the St. Mary's River and Sault Ste. Marie. There's these purple one, or these blue ones here are the ones that Ryan are talking about, the proposed ones that are likely going into the US side of Lake Huron. One other project that we have, here, I'll go back a slide, where this part of the Together with Gigoyak is broad scale, like Ryan said, 23 kilometers apart from each receiver. That's good for tracking movements of populations of fish broadly, but what about more precise movement? So with these ones, it's like pinball. Like you'll get a ding on one of the receivers and it'll go right to the other one, and then back and forth in zigzag. Where we want to know more fine scale movement. So we have this project Bamaj, which in Ojibwe means to track or to follow a trail along, where we're going to be super focused when you have receivers very close together, overlapping in range, you'll be able to triangulate where the fish is exactly and follow them along the direct path. And we're planning to do that this year on the shoal that we caught fish last year for the tagging efforts. So we'll be able to learn more about spawning behavior with lake whitefish. In other years, we hope to move this project to other shoals, hopefully on the Lake Huron side. And the telemetry, the fine scale telemetry is one part of Ramage, and the other part is remote sensing. So we've acquired an underwater remotely operated vehicle there in the right-hand corner, and we'll be using that to physically assess the shoals. There's cameras on that thing and arms and stuff, so we'll be able to go and actually look at the shoals, look at the fish activity on those shoals during spawning times and get a better understanding. Right now, there's a lot of problems with shoal habitat, like algal growth or Dresinid mussels. There's an image there of a pile of Dresinid mussels. That was from a 1 hour set when I was doing my chub or my Cisco research. It was about 350 to 400 feet deep. We had the nets in the water on the bottom for about an hour, and we lifted them up and they were swamped with quagga and zebra mussels. And that's not great for the fish harvesters. That really wrecks their nets, and it's not, those mussels filter out the water and eat little microorganisms that other fish rely on. So it's not very good. So hopefully with this ROV, we'll be able to, get a good idea of how infested the shoals are with algae and also mussels. I don't know if you had anything else to add, Ryan.
No, nothing else on my end. I know we're probably running a little bit over time maybe, but.
Okay, you can take it away then.
Yeah, just to, I won't talk long on it because I know that our time is probably drawing to a close, but another big thing that we're working on is actually is Saugeen community concerns about fish stocking, and in particular concerns about what the impacts are of species like Chinook salmon and rainbow trout and so on that are being stocked in Georgian Bay and Lake Huron. We all know that we just had the Owen Sound Salmon Spectacular. But the reality is that those fish that everybody is fishing for, those big salmon that make the papers and so on are not species that are native to the waters. They're from the Pacific coast. And for many years, Saugeen community members and leadership have really tried to push the issue that, maybe it isn't such a good thing that we're putting all of these exotic fish into the waters. And, at the end of the day, there's never been any real consultation with Saugeen to go and do those activities. And it really has created a history of conflict between Saugeen fishers, for example, and as well as local sports anglers. And we believe that it has affected the economy of Saugeen and the fishery, as well as culture. For example, just we mentioned earlier about the totem system, and these fish don't necessarily have a part of that, are not a part of that totem system. They're not part of the culture of Saugeen, and it's something being imposed through these stocking programs. And then just what is the impact of these species on the ecology of the lake? There's all kinds of changes going on in the lake as it is, between climate change and invasive species. And really these species like Chinook salmon, rainbow trout, they're reproducing in the wild. And they're just another, at the end of the day, they're another invasive species that is causing damage to the environment out there. So, you know, I know it is fun for people to go out and and catch a big salmon, but the reality is that, you know, we got to think about what the impact is from those stocking activities. So just something to think about. Yeah, it's just the magnitude of the stalking that takes place. It's quite intensive. We're talking about thousands and thousands of fish.
And I think back to my interviews, and a number of individuals would always reiterate, you know, like, these fish have to eat something. And if you guys ever followed along with the Derby, these fish get quite enormous, and they have to eat a lot to maintain that size and to survive. And, you know, they're they have to be eating a lot of native species of fish, and that's that is a threat to our fishery.
So one of the things that we are embarking on with the Ministry of Natural Resources is looking at fish stocking and actually sitting down and doing some of the work on fish stocking that probably should have happened, you know, many years ago before fish stocking even started. But anyway, we are using the two-eyed seeing approach, which includes a literature review as well as saw knowledge about what's going on in the waters and with respect to fish stocking, and then talking about Saugeen's own fishery goals and objectives, and really a joint action plan on how to move things forward. And really the idea behind it is to get as much information as we can so that there can be some informed decision making about things like activities like fish stocking, and then, you know, this ultimate idea about reconciliation and what reconciliation might mean. So just some food for thought there on fish stocking and what we're doing with that.
One thing to add, it's just this project in particular is with the Ministry of Natural Resources, and the history with that ministry and the SON has been rough, to say the least. We mentioned restrictive rules on the fishery and all of the stocking and stuff, and this represents, I think, a good step forward for the ministry, trying to address the past and working with us in a good way. And with that, I think that's the end of our presentation. We have a little video here of when we were tagging whitefish. So we'd get our fishermen to catch the fish, bring it back to us, and we'd have them in holding tanks. As you can see, some of them are floating upside down. That's likely because their swim bladder hasn't yet acclimatized to the location there. They were picked off the bottom in gill nets. And once they kind of level themselves out, we sedate them with an anesthetic, MS-222. We perform the surgery, let them recover from the anesthetic and the surgery, and then release them. So I just always like seeing whitefish. You usually don't see them swimming around. So with that, I think I can speak for Ryan and Sid, and I'd like to thank you guys for having us here, and we're available to answer any of your questions. Here's just the Nawash fish assessment website, and then we also have one with information about our fishery, saugeenfishing.ca. And I'll stop sharing my screen. Okay, so I guess we could field some questions. I'm looking in the Q&A here. There's a question from James Mitchell. The question could be asked: I've heard people comment that we shouldn't be releasing salmon into Georgian Bay and instead should be encouraging sturgeon. What are your thoughts on this? I'd pass that over to Ryan and Sid.
Yeah, I don't know. Sid, if you want this one or me, doesn't matter to me.
Well, I would say exactly that if you're going to stock something, it should be indigenous, and the form that is used to stock is of particular interest, because just putting eggs in a tank and hatching them out and then throwing the fish in the water isn't the proper way of actually stocking the fish.
One comment on that, I guess there was extensive lake trout rehabilitative stocking in Lake Huron, and they sourced their eggs and their fish from I think the Finger Lakes, and there were other locations around in this area, and they stocked them into the lake, and there were some issues there. Correct, Ryan?
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, I know there's a First Nation Shawanaga. It's Shawanaga, right? That stocks walleye.
Yep.
Yeah. Do you want to speak to that at all, Ryan?
Yeah. So I know how Sid had mentioned that there are some methods of stocking that, that might be more effective than, this idea of just raising something in a tank that and then putting it out into the lake. And well, I guess there's 2 points to that. One is that Saugeen actually does have a traditional method of restocking the lake, which is to mix the eggs and the milk from whitefish, for example, and then put them back onto the shoals. So that was something that is widely known to have been done historically. So there are some practices like that. And then if you look at Shawanaga, they have a really interesting operation where when they catch fish, walleye in particular from the river, they take the eggs and the milk and they mix them and they do their hatchery right on the bank of the river, so that the imprinting from those fish takes place with the water where they're going to be returning to. So that was one of the concerns that Sid had mentioned earlier about how stocking is done. So that's something that they've been doing for a number of years now, and they've been quite successful with it. So
I see David Morris has a number of questions here. What do Cisco's feed on? They feed on microorganisms like zooplankton. The larger lake herring will also feed on smaller fish and oftentimes eggs. Yeah, that's for Cisco's. Another one of his questions are, how are your research programs funded? I'll let Ryan answer that one.
yeah, that's a complex question. I mean, in a lot of cases, we're competing for grants. For example, we've received funding by applying for grants to the Great Lakes Fisheries Committee, funding for Nawash came from an organization called the Great Lakes Observing System. So there's a whole bunch of agencies and things out there that have grants available for doing research, and very much like university professors and academics go out there and seek out these grants. We do the same thing. So that's how we're able to fund most of our research.
And then his last question, does Saugeen have any relationship with the DFO, Department of Fisheries and Oceans?
Any relationship? I'm not sure I totally understand that question, I guess.
Or perhaps maybe we could speak to what the relationship is.
Well, we
Sid,
do
you wanna take that
have
one?
that we do have a relationship with DFO, because when they're working within the territory, there's this duty to consult. So we do have a relationship. It's not maybe the best. It hopefully will become better over time. So the way it stands now is there is a duty to consult when they're in the territory, and have been respecting that somewhat. So that's kind of our relationship.
We have a question from Thomas in the chat. Are there restocking initiatives underway at present? Successes? I'm not sure if that's for sturgeon or just in general, but I mean, we mentioned walleye. I know in the States, there's a number of stocking programs. In particular, I mean, I like Cisco, so they stock lake herring in Saginaw Bay. I think it's Saginaw Bay. I have to double check, but they do stock Cisco's in Michigan, quite a considerable amount. Yeah. Question from Janice: where can we locally buy fairly caught fresh Georgian Bay whitefish? There are a number of our fish harvesters active in the territory. We shared a couple images of fish harvesters with sturgeon, and that's Robichaud Commercial Fishing. They have a Facebook page, and they often update where they're fishing and when they'll be back on dock. There are several others. I don't know if you want to mention that, Ryan. I'll put all of our emails in the chat, and I guess Ryan would be your easiest way to connect to fish harvesters.
Yeah, a lot of the fish harvesters do sell at markets. Like Alex mentioned, there's Robichaud Fishing, and they have a Facebook page where you can connect with them. Tommy Howells does buy his lake trout and lake whitefish are from our locally caught fish, so that's another option.
Okay. There's another question from James Mitchell. Has or will SON make recommendations and calls for action on preservation and encouragement of sturgeon stocks? Sometimes these recommendations are challenging to our current economy, but they should still be made and considered with a 7th-generation approach.
Yes. That's the short answer. Yes, we've been trying everything that we can to stop a lot of these stocking programs. Worried about that the different fish aren't indigenous, and just what they're doing to the ecosystem. I think the Ministry of Natural Resources is starting to understand, which I don't think they have in the past. And we definitely need to do everything that we can to increase the sturgeon populations, because like the passenger pigeons, once they're gone, and that's the end of it.
Okay, I don't know how long everyone's going to stay on for, but maybe we could answer 2 more individuals' questions. I don't know. There's one from Jeanette. Do the sports fishermen / women show any interest in the health of the ecosystem of the lakes with regard to stocking with native species? And I'll pass that to Ryan to answer that one.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't really answer on behalf of the sports anglers. I'm not quite sure what their position is on that, but yeah, it's a hard question for me to answer on behalf of them.
I guess I know their definite interest is in fish that are enjoyable and put up a good fight to catch. I think maybe that's why they like some of the larger salmon species and stuff like that. And then a question from Rosemary Martin. How big of an impact do the invasive round gobies have on the local ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the answer is complicated because round goby, yes, they are an invasive species, and the concern about round gobies in particular is that they have a strong preference to eat fish eggs. So they do certainly decimate, as far as egg laying goes, they love to get into those fish eggs and eat them. So they do have a strong negative effect that way. I think that whenever an invasive species comes in, something like brown goby, it sometimes takes the fish that are already present a little while to figure out, what, okay, this round goby is actually good to eat. And we're actually doing some work on stomach content analysis, and just from the fish stomachs that I've collected, I've definitely seen a lot of round gobies inside of fish, for example, like lake trout, for example. They certainly eat a lot of them. So they are, I guess, becoming part of the food chain along with everything else.
And hopefully with our ROV, we'll be able to see their presence on the spawning shoals. Yeah, so that might be interesting. And then Rosemary's other question. There's only one species of chub left of many species. Is there interest in reintroducing the other species of chub? There is, so the jury's out there. Cisco's and chubs in particular are very complex species. There's a lot of missing puzzle pieces right now. In Lake Huron, the one form or species that's left is referred to a hybrid form, and even that's just a theory at best. They're deep water and they're hard to know about, and there is interest in reintroducing them. The Great Lakes Fishery Commission has a mandate to reintroduce the deep water fish community in the Great Lakes and Lake Hurons in particular, and part of a team that's right now just compiling literature and information about past and present distributions of these fish. So hopefully one day we'll be able to get them back in the water. Should I keep going through the questions, or how are we feeling?
Hi, guys. We're getting into 8:40 is what it looks like. If you want to answer one more question, that's fine. And then we'll say our goodbyes after that.
Okay, cool. AM, they have a question. How have local fish populations changed over the past decades? What is the hope for the future? I'll pass. I think Ryan, you can answer that one quite well.
All right, what was the time span?
Just over the past few decades.
Oh, yeah, so there's been dramatic changes over the last few decades. So the invasive species have certainly been a big part of that. In particular, the draceniid mussels, so the zebra and quagga mussels. It's fairly widely accepted that the impact of those mussels has been just so dramatic. Basically, they're filter feeders, and they're feeding on all the little plankton that's floating around in the water. And the plankton is really the bottom of the food chain for everything in the lake. So they're so effective at filtering out all that plankton that there isn't a whole lot of food left for everything else. So the productivity as a whole throughout the lake has dramatically declined. And that goes for really across the board for all the different fish species. So what have we seen? A dramatic decline in abundance of fish in general. And that's part of that is whether it be lake whitefish or sturgeon. I suspect that everything is feeling the effects of that invasive species. And that's really just we could talk all night about what's going on out in the lake and what's gone on in the last few decades. But that is really some of the strong things that are happening. And then as far as what the future holds, I don't think anybody really knows the answer to that question because we continue to have invasive species that are showing up. We have concerns about some of the Asian carp species that are moving up from the States, whether it be the the big head carp and so on that makes the news. And I'm sure there's lots of invasive species coming that we're not even aware of. They're not even really on our horizon yet. And then also with climate change and everything else, there's just so many things that will continue to affect the lake. I certainly it's beyond me to fully understand what the future holds, but time will tell.
Mhm.
That's my perspective.
Okay, another one for you, Ryan, or maybe Sid. Laura's asking about the Stop the Fish Factory signs and how they show up on the way into Cape Croker. She recognizes that it's a controversial question.
Yes, I've been there. The only thing that I can really say about it, this group that is planning on doing it with the duty to consult, they have come and consulted the First Nation. We haven't seen all of what it is that they want to do just yet. And they said over the next short while, they'll share that. But there hasn't been any decisions made around that, or but they have, under the duty to consult, they have consulted with the First Nation.
And Laura's follow-up, so it's not a First Nations group. From my understanding, it's not a First Nations group. No, I think it's just a company that's proposed to build a fish factory or a fish farm rather.
Yeah, I think that Pam had mentioned wanting to wrap up the questions, so
That's kind of a good way, guys, to to broach that subject. I think we could spend a great deal of time on that subject because there's a lot of very anxious people wondering what the heck is going on and if things are going to be done in a good way, and is it something that's going to be good for the environment, or there's a lot of questions. So it's quite the little powder keg, I'm sure, but it's so nice to hear that finally things are happening, that there's a mesh between some government things and SON, because there's good parts on there's good parts on both sides for sure. It's about time that we started to really work together and to listen to each other and learn from our experience and not just keep on going blindly. So, gentlemen, your presentation was excellent. It was so nice to hear about the sturgeon. I remember the very first one I saw was when a gentleman had caught one in the Derby, actually, and had brought it to my husband. He was a taxidermist, and that was the very first one I'd ever seen, and it was quite the prehistoric looking thing. So it's very sad to think that they're actually on the decline after being here for millions and millions of years. So hopefully there's something we can do. You've brought up a lot of really good points. Lots of people are very interested. So hopefully we can get you back at some point and hear a little bit more of what you have to say about some of the things that are happening to our fisheries and to our natural world. So thank you, gentlemen, each and every one of you.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, it was very good. Okay, so have a good rest of the week. I'm going to be very busy. I'm sure the rest of you will be too. So pleasant to have you. Thank you. Goodbye.
bye everyone.